Conversations across time. 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 Conversations across time.
Welcome to Conversations Across Time, the show that allows you, the viewer, to experience imaginary conversations between immortals, historical figures from different time periods. My co-host and I, former State Representative Babette Josephs, have the pleasure of once again having a conversation with Theodor Herzl. Mr. Herzl is considered the father of Zionism and the father of the State of Israel. And one of the things that characterizes his life is that he felt the Jews needed a homeland. Welcome, Mr. Herzl.
It's good to be back.
And seated next to Mr. Herzl is Dr. Ralph Bunche. Dr. Bunche is the first black man to earn a PhD from Harvard University in the area of political science. Dr. Bunche is also the architect and principal negotiator for the establishment of the State of Israel, and he negotiated this between the Palestinian people and the Zionists who were interested in forming a homeland. Welcome, Dr. Bunche.
Thank you for the invitation.
And seated next to Dr. Bunche is Ismael. Ismael is the firstborn son of Abraham. His mother was a slave woman, an Egyptian slave woman by the name of Hagar. Ismael is the apostle and primary ancestor of the Arabic people. Welcome, Prophet Ismael.
You called my mother a slave. And while I appreciate the invitation to be present, I take exception to the idea that my mother was a chattel of Abraham or his wife.
And please accept, and I'd like you to explain, but please accept my apologies, because I understand as the descendant of slaves how that would make you feel.
I doubt that you could know how it makes me feel. It's just a historical inaccuracy. The fact is that relations among households and those who were considered part of the household and those who simply lived within a household, those divisions have shifted over time. And to call my mother a slave is, at best, an oversimplification. At worst, a distortion. She was a handmaiden at various points, but that's not the same as one who is bidden to bring water or
understood. And I think for purposes of our discussion, it might help our audience to understand that I meant no disrespect, but I wanted to characterize your mother as being of Egyptian origin. So would you accept that description?
Hagar, the Egyptian, is an epithet that is difficult to dispute.
Okay. I thank you. Now, when we were here last, we were talking about the Middle East and how what happened historically led to the situation and the crises, as you explained, Dr. Bunche, that is going on in the Middle East now. We have posted a new map, and I want you to just take a look at that map, because it is for us to get a clear understanding of the significance of what happened in the Middle East. We cannot separate what is going on in the Middle East today, as was going on then, without having a historical context. And I want to read something to you from a book written by David Jurgen, one of my favorite books, called The Prize. And in the prologue, Mr. Jurgen does set out the backdrop of what happened in the Middle East and what happened with oil. The book is called The Prize, and it refers to oil. In 1911, Winston Churchill was one of the leaders of the economists of the British cabinet who shared the belief that increased military spending promoted by some other members to keep ahead of the Anglo-German naval race was foolish. Churchill argued that war with Germany was not inevitable. On July 1st, 1911, Kaiser Wilhelm sent a German naval vessel into the harbor of Agadir on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. His purpose was to check French influence in Africa. For several weeks, fear of German intentions gripped all of Europe. Churchill concluded after the German incursion in Agadir that war with Germany was in fact inevitable. He vowed to prepare Britain. The technical way Churchill decided to modernize the British Navy would have vast implications for the 20th century. It was of utmost importance to convert the British Navy to oil as a power source. Up until that time, the British Navy relied solely on Welsh coal for power. Now, the British would be reliant on oil from the Middle East. Oil had strategic benefits, greater speed, and more efficient use of manpower. Churchill decided British naval supremacy would be based on oil. From the eve of World War I, Britain and other Western powers have had an interest in the politics of the Middle East, particularly Palestine because of its strategic position for access to vast oil reserves. The British cabinet decided to attack the Ottoman Empire and installed a sultan in 1914. And this sultan was someone over whom they had control. Now, what this tells us is when we talk about war, we talk about the necessity of oil. And also the fact that Western powers are more interested in the Middle East for its oil reserves as opposed to any notion of what is right and wrong for the residents of that area. So that being said, some things about this I know strike you, Babette. First of all, that Churchill, like you and I, more interested in social programs.
I never knew that. I think that's very interesting. But he concluded, and I guess history tells us that he was right, that war was inevitable because war happened.
Yes.
But it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that economic superiority had to do with what went on in the Middle East and other places, and is still going on.
Exactly.
Oil is still essential to us. Oil is still a fuel, even though we try to wean ourselves from it in feeble little ways. We need it, and there's vast reserves in the Middle East, and until we either wean ourselves or we run out of oil or some terrible catastrophe happens, we will continue to have this conflict, I think.
And Dr. Bunche, the last time that we were here and you were talking about what led us to some of the problems that we're having, or the problems that we're having in the Middle East, it's important, I for one would like to know, did you consider the importance of oil when in fact you were negotiating the boundaries for the establishment of the State of Israel and the Western interest in having a foothold in the Middle East?
There are a number of things that were true about my position as a representative of the United Nations as opposed to the United States State Department that imply that oil was in fact in the conversation. I can't say that it was not, but I will say that the focus of our discussions had to do with creating a sense of balance among the participants. Oil is, in fact, could be said to be at the bottom of the entire matter, as the influx of the colonial influence was focused on that particular control. It was not my place or my aspiration to assist in that particular task, but to be able to balance that gravitational force in the conversation between people who had a history of getting along and who needed to find a way to get along.
I guess a question that I have is, I understand that your mission, so to speak, in the negotiations on Rhodes Island had to do with the coming up with a way that people who had gotten along in the past could coexist. I, for one, find it hard to believe that you, as a former officer in the Office of Strategic Service, which of course is the precursor to the CIA, I guess I wonder how you make that break from being an OSS person / CIA to becoming a diplomat primarily interested in the peaceful coexistence of. I mean, it seems hard to believe that you can simply dismiss your background and training as an OSS person.
It would also, to borrow a word from last week's show, be naive. All of these things focus and feed into what it is that I had to do. The oil was more of something that needed to be contended with from a colonial interest perspective. And of course, the oil and access to it, and also access to religious spaces of note in all of the cultures that were present. Oil most certainly was a part of the discussion, and it found its way into the negotiation. But I think that the weight that we can assign to it from this perspective in history was not necessarily present in the forefront of the discussions.
I guess what I want to know and we're going to take a break, but I want to know what it was that you required of the parties when you sat down to negotiate. Now, we do have the understanding that the Arabs boycotted some of these discussions, but I'd like to know what were some of the things that you thought the parties needed to come to an agreement on. And given that, it's interesting to me because as we sit here with Ismael, I wonder what his perception, what his understanding is of the fact that his father, the descendants he's as a descendant of Abraham, as his son, that it's essentially the people who are descended from him are fighting with the descendants of his brother. I wonder how that affects you when you look at what's going on in the Middle East today. But I'd like us to take up these topics when we come back after break. Thank you. back. Before the break, I posited a question to you, Ismael, and it had more to do with the fact that we are faced with difficulties in the Middle East, and we know, or at least it's my belief, that a lot of it centers around oil. But how does this impact upon you when you realize that your descendants are essentially quarreling with your brother's descendants? I mean, that's exactly what is happening here. And that there seemed to be a basis and an historical period when they got along and they coexisted peacefully.
There is no dispute among the children of Abraham. The dispute is created by lines that were drawn that have no meaning to people who actually live on either side of them. It's unfortunate, but it's easily understood when in the context of sowing discord from without into within. It's that simple.
Which is always in the interest of a colonial power, and certainly almost always in the interest of Great Britain.
So this Great Britain is...
But Ismael makes a very valid point.
Yes.
It's almost impossible to draw boundary lines that satisfy every national, cultural, ethnic group. You can look at all of the agreements after World War I, and where they tried to break up the Austro-Hungarian Empire and create countries, and they had different and there were always clashes among the different groups.
You can look at Crimea.
Exactly. Right now we can look at the Crimeans, same with the Ukrainians. The point is that the Jews and the Arabs have more in common than any of these people, so it should be easier to not draw those kind of lines and make Jerusalem a separate city and have different capitals. And I envisioned a utopian country where Arabs and Muslim Arabs and Jews would have equal rights, share in the economy, and live in a very, very, very real world. It's the outside influence, oil, other economic interests, access to trade routes, canals, waterways, that exasperate the problem. There's no reason why Arabs and Jews cannot get along.
That peace will not happen until the cause for discord is erased, namely the point at which oil becomes unnecessary and uninteresting to anyone.
Right, I agree.
The essence of our challenge at the Isle of Rhodes was to sew together these visions of possibility of peaceable coexistence. Arguably, the notion of oil and the colonial interests brought a gravitational force that was disruptive in the conversation and therefore not really included. It was more of a vision of how it is that that Palestinians and Jews could in fact find a way to coexist. The undercurrent of the oil matter that we keep focusing on, and I imagine rightly so, because it is the issue that brings energy in that destabilizes the relationships. And I imagine history could fairly point to the establishment of Israel, not as a homeland, but as a state, to kind of be a place card for the West's access to oil in the Middle East. This is not something that is far-fetched. And it's something that, in fact, comes as a toxicity or presents toxicity in the conversation of peace. So Ismael raises the set of circumstances that would make peace possible, and it would be the absence of not just importance of oil, but the placing of economic principles over those of humane principles.
Ambassador, may I ask one question, and this is a hypothetical. I know hypotheticals are not always fair. If there had not been a Holocaust, do you think the state of Israel would have been created?
Had there not been a Holocaust, the argument that you raise for that may well have had a different, rang differently, and I imagine it is true necessarily that the discussion would have not included some sense of the need to provide recompense, to provide some sort of safety. So I guess it would be fair to say that that's true. On the other hand, the way that conflict happens is through greed and the colonial imperial approach to it. So I imagine that those atrocities may well have found another way to express themselves.
Now, when you say that, Mr. Herzl, I think one of the things that we need to make clear, at least for our audience, is because there is a thought, and that in fact Europe and the Western entities were interested in establishing a homeland for Jews as a result of guilt that they felt about ignoring the Holocaust. And I know that's what your question alluded to.
People are not motivated by guilt. They are motivated by interests. And the idea that a Jewish state would not have been created if not for the Holocaust, it's perhaps an interesting topic to consider, but if there hadn't been a Jewish state, how else would England have gotten the oil?
Which is the focus of my point about it finding another way to express itself.
Yes.
The placation, if you will, that particular vision of the motivation of Europe, I don't believe is incorrect, but they would have found another motivation.
Okay.
So
because they wanted that foothold, and they would have found a justification. But I'm not sure that people are not motivated somewhat by guilt. I don't think it's the biggest motivator, but I think that
only from their mothers.
It works. See, just like the Jews.
I was getting ready to say.
I was going to say that. The bet you stole my thunder, but okay.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I think when you look at it from the standpoint of the motivation that there would have been something else that would have led to the establishment of Western interests, I'm at some point very angered when I hear the right wing of this country stand up and discuss the significance of Israel from any standpoint other than acknowledging why. I mean, they paint it in terms that it sounds as though it's a religious reason, and perhaps maybe to the right wing oil and money is their religion. But I'm somewhat dismayed when I hear the characterization of the right of Israel to exist without at least giving some thought to the right of the indigenous people who lived in Palestine before the creation of the State of Israel.
I think it's sort of worse than that, really. I think there are many fundamentalist Christians in the right wing of this country who believe that Israel needs to be Christianized, or I've heard re-Christianized. I don't know what the re is about. And that's one of the reasons why they are interested in Israel, as well as the economic reasons, which I think you have really outlined. But here's a place where you can proselytize, right?
Yes.
And isn't that important to them? Yes.
Can we address something else that is also important, and that has to do with the fact that there is also this concept that and among the Jewish community, some in the Jewish community, when you speak against the aggression against the Palestinians, that in fact somehow you're anti-Semitic. I mean, that's both ridiculous because the Arabs and the Jews are both Semites, so I have a hard time understanding what that means. But I'd like us to speak for a moment, because it's sort of a topic that it's not comfortable for people to discuss that.
Well, within the Zionist movement, we had our own schisms about how Zionism should work, or even if the homeland should actually be where it was. And the people who opposed me, or the people I opposed, certainly could not be anti-Semitic. It was just an anti-policy, or
Exactly.
against their policy. They're certainly not anti-Semitic. And the Arabs in the region who are against the policy of the Israeli government or the Knesset are not anti-Semitic. They're anti those policies, and that's what people. And it's easy to throw out because it's a catchword. It's
Yes.
like you're a communist, you're a Nazi, you're whatever it is, and it dismisses any sane argument.
And it really intimidates the person who is making those arguments.
Especially if the person is Jewish.
If I criticize some policy of Israel, which I would do in the same vein as I criticize some policy of any other government, including our own, then suddenly I get labeled as anti-Semitic or a self-hating Jew, and I'm merely criticizing the government. That's, I feel, is my privilege.
I agree.
Yeah. I think it's important for us to leave the audience with some questions, and paramount has to do with when we start discussing the Middle East. How do we take it out of the context that in fact these are cousins? That's essentially.
That's even to call Jews and Arabs cousins is a distortion of facts. In reality, people in this region have intermarried for the entire
Yes.
span of history.
That is correct.
And
You were correct.
And these are not separate families or families that once branched out. They are continually and repeatedly joined over generations.
Which would, of course, explain the articulation of the Sharif of Mecca when he asked the Palestinians to welcome their Jewish brethren.
But it also explains because the most bitter fights are between family members. I was once a family lawyer, and believe me,
Oh, yes.
those are the most bitter fights. So it's the biggest love and the biggest intermingling, but it's also the most bitter hatreds.
So that this has been a very interesting discussion. It takes us to something that I would hope the audience will investigate and think about from a different light. And that is, as you pointed out, Ismael, this is the family, these are the children of Abraham, these are the descendants of Abraham. And Dr. Bunche, the external forces are what has caused the problem that we are experiencing in the Middle East. I think that this conversation has been interesting in illuminating that, and I do thank you so much, Mr. Herzl. I thank you so much, Dr. Bunche. I thank you, Ismael, and always my co-host, Babette.
My pleasure, always.
And we have enjoyed this discussion, and we hope to have you back at some point because of what is heating up now in the Middle East. Once again, is a topic that we need to have a conversation about. Thank you. I am Vivian Crawford. This has been Conversations Across Time, and we look forward to you rejoining us for another interesting conversation across time. Thank you, and good night.
Conversations across time, 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 conversations across